So you're thinking about moving to Southern Maine and you're trying to figure out if this is the right place for you. Typically on this channel, we make a lot of videos about the different pros and cons of towns, different stuff going on, lots of listing videos, really all things real estate in Southern Maine. But as realtors, we obviously want to promote people living in the area, but at the same time, we do have an obligation to tell people like why you shouldn't move to Maine, because it's not for everybody. Let's get into it. By the way, my name's Margaret, and if you want to know everything there is about living in Southern Maine, make sure to subscribe below so you can be the first to know about the current market here in Southern Maine. If you have any questions at all, feel free to give us a call, shoot us a text, send an email, or schedule a Zoom call. All that information's in the description below. If you find this video helpful, make sure to give us a like down below. It helps us out tremendously. The first thing I want to talk about is the weather here in Maine. So Maine, obviously being in the Northeast, experiences all 4 seasons, and we do have a pretty long winter. We really only experience, those hot summer months for probably, 2.5 months out of the year. Aside from that, it's going to be below 80 degrees. Definitely. It's even below 80 sometimes in the summer, a lot of times in the summer. So if you're moving from somewhere like down south or just somewhere that's more warm in general, this can be a bit of a shock for some people. I always like to recommend immersing yourself in, the different aspects of Maine and the different activities we have to offer, and really enjoying and finding a way to enjoy the outside even in those winter months. That way, you find it more enjoyable versus just being cooped up inside and, not really getting outside and ignoring everything and, getting a vitamin D deficiency. Get out there, enjoy things, go skiing, go ice skating, learn all the different things there is out there, and enjoy the weather and the different seasons, because it may not be what you're used to. There is definitely an advantage to having them. And while I think they're great, they aren't for everybody. And that's why I recommend, if you have to move up here or you're relocating for work and you're really hesitant about the weather, get outside, enjoy the activities. The fall is my favorite season, for instance. There's plenty of fun things to do in the fall, even though it's not, it may not be 80 degrees, but there's still lots to do. But yeah, the weather can be a bit of a disadvantage. It's not always, those white snowy Christmases like you see in the movies. What they're not showing in those movies is the brown sludge on the side of the road after that white Christmas. So the weather can be a bit of a disadvantage. The next thing I want to talk about is the bugs in Maine. So Maine is fortunate enough to not have lots of creepy crawlies, lots of big spiders or snakes, for instance, but we do have a lot of mosquitoes outside, and we do have a lot of ticks, depending on where you live, or if you spray for ticks or that type of thing. I can pretty much guarantee if you talk to most people who live in Maine or New England in general, you're going to meet or you're going to know quite a few people. Everybody knows, 1 or 2 people that have Lyme disease, unfortunately, which comes from ticks. If you don't know, if you're coming from an area that doesn't have ticks, or a lot of mosquitoes, that can definitely be not even just a shock, but just an inconvenience that you're going to have to deal with all the time if you're outside. And mosquitoes can definitely get annoying. Everybody, or, a lot of people are very fearful of ticks. It can make things kind of unpleasant sometimes, and that's definitely a disadvantage to, living in Maine. There's really not much of a plus for that one. The third thing I want to talk about is allergies here in Maine. So because we do have all 4 seasons, you are going to experience seasonal allergies in the springtime and even a little bit in the fall. We do have a couple of days every year where the pollen falls very heavily, or even sometimes, for 1 or 2 weeks, we'll get a lot of pollen. It coats pretty much everything. Your car, you're going to need to wash your car. It really may not even be worth it to do that until after all the pollen has come down. But yeah, we do. A lot of people experience seasonal allergies. Zyrtec probably makes a ton off of people living in New England, but yeah, it can be a bit of a downside. Not everybody experiences them. I personally don't experience any seasonal allergies, but I know a lot, if not most people do. The next thing I want to talk about is the cost of living in Maine. So as you may know, the cost of living in New England and out on like the western coast by California, the cost of living is significantly higher than the national average. So Maine is no exception to that, being the northeastern-most state. It is more expensive living in New England. Being someone that's lived here for the vast majority of my life, I'm accustomed to paying a lot for different things. And, I see videos all the time about people living in Texas paying so much less for everything, including real estate. And, you think, oh, that must be so nice. But living up here, I'm kind of used to it, but most people aren't, obviously. And so that can be a huge shock moving to really anywhere in New England, and Maine's no exception, that you're going to have to pay a lot more. The cost of living's higher. The property taxes are also higher than the national average. So that is definitely a downside to living in Maine. With that said, Maine is considered the most affordable state in all of New England. So, if you're relocating here because of work or for family or for, a million other reasons, and you're looking to find somewhere maybe, the most affordable in New England, Maine is the right state for you. I also wanted to briefly mention that we do have a relocation guide out now. The link to that is down in the description below. So if you're moving or relocating to the area, feel free to download that completely free of charge, and hopefully it's of a lot of use to you. I also want to touch on the fact that Maine's population is quite small. Maine is a pretty small state in general, but the population here is really only, in between 1 million, 1.5 million people. Obviously, there's more people than that in a lot of big cities across the country. So as you can imagine, most of Maine is pretty rural. I would describe southern Maine, where we primarily focus, as more suburban, as most of the population of Maine does happen to live down here in York and Cumberland County, but obviously it's still a lot more rural than, a lot of other places in the country, especially if you're moving here from somewhere like New York. We get a lot of people from New York, a lot of people from Massachusetts, in and around the Boston area. And, people like it because there's less people, for a lot of people buying their second homes. There's a reason they're relocating to the area. But, if that's not something you're expecting, it can definitely be a bit of a culture shock having so few people here and things being a little bit slower. The next thing I want to talk about is the lack of diversity in the state of Maine. Maine is a primarily homogeneous state, meaning there is not much diversity here at all, which is obviously a huge con to living in the area. And if this is something that's important to you, as it is for a lot of people, Maine may not be the state for you. The next thing I want to touch on is the tourist season here in Maine. Maine is pretty heavily reliant on tourism, and we do get a lot of it. So pretty much from May all the way through September, for the most part, we do experience what we consider to be tourist season, especially peaking in July and August. The reason I have this listed as a con is because Maine and southern Maine and really the rest of the state really was just not built for that many people coming to visit. And so it does back up the roads quite a bit. When you move to the area, it's definitely important to learn the back roads to get to and from different towns, because you're going to have to avoid Route 1 and a lot of those busy roads, just because there's an influx of tens of thousands of people visiting the state every single year, a lot of them tending to come to the coast, southern Maine, York County, Cumberland County, really all the way up the coast in general. But there is definitely a big focus on tourism down here because we do have pretty much the best beaches in the entire state. So when you move to Maine, there is definitely a downside of having to deal with a lot more people coming to the state if you're not really prepared for that, or we're not aware of this, and the traffic that that's going to bring. And the last thing I want to mention, or really just touch on, is the fact that there is a stereotype of people in New England and Maine being mean. This has been going on for years, and I don't know as if anybody really knows the real reason or why this, stereotype started. But I think what causes this is just the people from southern states used to all that southern hospitality coming up to the north and really just not experiencing that quite as much. And so they really just think people here are mean, when in reality, that is just not the case at all, especially here in Maine. I can't really speak to all of the different states in New England, but Maine specifically, anybody will tell you, has a much slower pace of life. People here are not mean by any stretch. But yeah, Maine, it's a lot slower here. Anybody will tell you that there's a slower pace in life. Even when you're just driving down the road in traffic, you know, you're going to experience, nobody's going to honk at you. You'd have to cut somebody off pretty bad for them to honk at you here. Whereas, you know, even if you drive down into Massachusetts, you're going to experience honking on a regular basis. Things are a lot slower here. People, generally speaking, are pretty happy here. But if you are from a state where, you know, you're used to that Southern hospitality and people being more warm and fuzzy, and, you know, moving to Maine, you may not get that quite so much. And so that could be a bit of a shock to you. All right, so those are all of the reasons you shouldn't move to Maine. Obviously, I could sit here and tell you a million more reasons why you should move to Maine for one reason or another. It's not for everybody. Nothing is a one-size-fits-all situation. And so Maine's not built for everybody. So those are all the reasons you shouldn't move here. I hope you found this video helpful. And again, my name's Margaret, and if you have any questions at all, feel free to give us a call, shoot us a text, send an email, or schedule a Zoom call. All that information's in the description below. See you next time.